Welcome back to Pro Life Without Borders with Sarah and Mikayla. Welcome. We are excited to be back with you here today. So we have realized, slightly belatedly, this is episode
12? 11? It's up there.
We're double digiting at this point. We have sort of realized that our episodes have not been streaming as successfully as we thought they were on the non-YouTube platforms. So if you listen to we have been telling you to listen wherever you listen to podcasts, and what we meant by that was listen on YouTube.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
We are working on it, and by we I mean Mikayla. I'm doing absolutely nothing. And the goal is to have all of the episodes up on your standard podcast platforms.
Yeah,
but we're not there yet. So if you have knowledge that you want to share with us about how to make it happen, feel free to do so. Otherwise, just be patient and we will get there.
I figure the people on YouTube probably don't know that this was a problem. It's the people who aren't listening.
Well, I'm assuming people are obviously so passionate about listening to this podcast that they're just looking everywhere. They're like, is it here? Is it here? Is it here? And then they finally find it on YouTube and they're like, finally, I spent hours. So I'm just letting them know.
It is 100% my bad. I really thought, I was like, we're killing it.
Yeah, we thought we were really knocking it out of the park. And we were.
No, I was not.
No, and the irony
is par for the course.
The irony is that Anthony's the one. My husband is the one that noticed, and he's the least technologically capable millennial I've ever met.
Oh, well, I don't care so much about what Anthony thinks.
He desperately wants to listen to our podcast because otherwise
I'll call him. I'll call him.
Shoot him a text.
Be here we go.
So the other thing that we have going on right now is our banquets. So Promise of Life Network is a privately funded nonprofit. We'll actually be talking about this in a week or two. Mm-hmm. And one of our big key fundraisers is our annual banquet. And so it's coming up October 24th and 25th. You can host a table. You can buy a table for any amount between there's several amounts, but between $500 and $10,000. If you would like to donate more than $10,000, you certainly can. That's just the limit.
Yeah, that's not the cutoff. It's not
there's actually not
you can't accept any more than $10,000.
Yeah, you can, whatever God leads you to donate a lot more. That's great too. If you would like to attend just as an individual and not purchase a table, you don't have to purchase a ticket, but there is an opportunity to be at the event, and of course it's a fundraiser, so that's sort of what it is. But you'll get to hear about ministry. You'll get to hear more about what we do. We'll actually be talking a little bit about podcasts, and you'll get to hear from a speaker who's one of my personal favorite people in the world, Amy Shearing. She's the executive director of a pregnancy center in Pittsburgh, and I want to be here when I grow up.
Yeah. So banquet season. It's gonna be so good.
I honestly,
I like the banquet.
I used to not like the banquet because I felt like it wasn't fun, and then we started adding activities to make it fun, and now I enjoy it a lot more.
I like the banquet. The lead up to the banquet is a little much.
It can be stressful.
Just a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, because we want to make it a good experience, and we want everything to go really well, and we want it to be really smooth, and we want people to leave thinking wow, that was a great ministry, and not wow, that went really horribly.
Which really doesn't happen. Well, we had one banquet that was kind of
13.
Yeah. But it's always fun.
Yeah. It always goes really well. And even the one that we struggled with, it was still a good event.
It was. We still raised money, and that money still saved babies.
Which is the whole thing.
That's the whole point.
Yeah. So that's coming up. So you should register. You can go to promiseoflifenetwork.org/banquet. We'd love to see you there. So today we are going to talk about IVF.
Yes.
In vitro fertilization. And it's actually kind of a hot button topic right now for a couple reasons. I know candidate. Now, he was the president. Is he still president?
Who are you talking about?
Trump?
He's a presidential candidate, but also a former president.
So you still call him president?
Oh, you're right. Some people still call him President Trump, but he's currently not the president.
Right, but don't you typically refer to former president as president?
That's kind of what I thought. But I also am a young whippersnapper who have only been able to vote for a decade.
Yeah. All right, we'll just call him.
So I kind of don't know, and then I started voting at a very weird time in American politics. So I don't know if we actually refer to former presidents as President so and so, or if that was a political statement that people were making.
Yeah,
I have no idea.
All right. Anyway, Donald Trump.
Anyway,
who
IVF.
was the president, maybe the president again, is currently working on becoming the president.
He's trying.
He made an announcement that he would pay, like, he wants the government or someone to cover IVF. I think, honestly, what he's going to do is they'll basically say it's covered by insurance, because right now it's not.
Right.
But I don't know all the ins and outs. So that's been in the news. And then the other thing that was in the news is recently an IVF clinic in Alabama.
Yes.
Accidentally killed, essentially, lost, damaged 2 or 3 embryos. And so at Alabama is allowing, like, the parents to, like, sue.
I also feel like IVF really came to the forefront after the Dobbs decision, and some of these, like, trigger laws went into place, and people started freaking out and were like, oh, like, IVF, like,
Right.
Like, there was a lot of panic about it, especially this year,
Yes.
more than anything. So it's in the news a lot.
It's in the news.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about a little bit, a couple things that we are going to say up front, and we're going to say several times throughout this episode, is that anyone conceived in IVF is valuable. And is made in God's image.
People are people?
Yes. You're not more people-y if you were conceived typically, and less people-y if you were conceived during IVF. Like, that's not a thing. People are people. Like, that's, again, weird things that we say. What's
the, like, people, a person's a person?
No matter how small.
No matter how small.
It's actually really
Yeah, no, he was really problematic in a lot of ways.
It's a great quote, though.
It is.
Anyway, so people conceived in IVF are valuable. Mm-hmm. Parents who choose to use IVF, while I may not agree with it, Mikayla may not agree with it, and we're going to talk about some of the problems with IVF, we are not coming at you. Okay, so please don't, like, email us, Facebook us, comment on our post, and be like, you hate people who chose IVF. That is absolutely not true. We're going to talk about some of the problems. We're going to talk about some of the challenges. We're going to talk about some of the ethical considerations. But please know that if you have chosen to use IVF, we're not saying, like, oh, you're a bad person or you're not a good Christian or anything like that.
And I think a lot of it, too, is information, right? Like, a lot of people, you don't know what you don't know.
Yes.
And you have to live with that sometimes. Mm-hmm. And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay to not know. And it's okay if you didn't know and now you do.
Yes. So basically, IVF is the act of conceiving a person, an individual, a human made in God's image outside of the female body. Okay, so typically, historically, throughout most of the world, conception has always occurred within a woman, right? So when a man and a woman love each other very much,
the birds and the bees
come out, and the man, like, they have the special hug.
Oh, no.
Anyway, so sperm meets egg inside the fallopian tube. Baby is formed.
Yes.
Moment of conception. Blastocyst, or zygote, I guess, is first, and then it starts moving along, which makes it a blastocyst. Implants inside the uterus. Okay, so we believe that life begins at conception. So the moment, I don't know how long it takes, the moment the sperm hits the egg, we have a separate human who has their own DNA, their own map of, like, who they're going to be, what their hair color, eye color, fingerprints, all of that is. Now, a lot of things can happen after that. So the embryo, the zygote, like, starts moving along the fallopian tubes, may not implant. Mom may never know she was pregnant because the baby didn't implant. She gets a period like normal. That happens. Who knows how often? Like, nobody really knows.
Yeah.
You could have the baby implant. You get a positive pregnancy test. You have a first trimester miscarriage, a second trimester miscarriage, a stillbirth. Like, a lot of negative, terrible things can happen.
Yeah, zygote could implant in the fallopian tube.
Yep, you could end up with an ectopic pregnancy that absolutely has to be treated. However, that person is a person. So just because terrible things or tragic things can happen after conception does not mean that that person is less person.
Yeah, your personness is 100% intact.
Right. And so I firmly believe that most women will get to heaven, and men, of course, it takes two, will get to heaven and find out they have children they had, like, no idea.
Yeah.
Because you miscarried so early, or, like, the baby never implanted, and you get to heaven and you're like, whoa, who are you? And they're like, Mommy, it's so great to see you. And you're like, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it won't happen just like that, but that's
that seems like a really traumatizing entrance to heaven, but
how I envision it. I'm looking forward to it. I have friends who are like, and if they probably watch this, so they're gonna laugh when they see it, but they're, like, obsessive pregnancy test takers. Like, they literally will test every day of the month. They get, like, little strips that are, like, 100. You can get, like, a zillion of them. I never test until I'm, like, a week late. And they're like, how do you wait so long? They're, like, every day testing. Like, do you see a line? And I'm like, I don't know. In 9 months, maybe a baby will pop out.
It'll be, like, a fun surprise.
Who knows? I don't know. Anyway, so IVF happens, and then the babies are conceived outside the womb. So that's really where the first problem comes into play. So because this is a numbers game, IVF is extremely expensive most of the time. So insurance often doesn't cover it. If they do cover it, they don't cover all of it. And so the IVF clinic is going to want you to make as many embryos as possible.
I think it would be helpful to explain exactly, like, what IVF is. Because we just talked about how actual babies are, like, actually made in the womb.
Yes.
And like IVF, so obviously a man and a woman, women love each other very much. That's how babies are made in the womb.
Right.
IVF is something entirely different.
Right. And so sometimes it's a married couple using the wife's eggs and the husband's sperm. Sometimes it's donor eggs and the husband's sperm. Sometimes it's donor sperm and the wife's eggs. Sometimes it's both donor sperm and donor eggs.
Yeah, but it's essentially retrieving eggs from a woman, whether it's a woman who's going to carry or some other woman.
Right, someone else.
Someone else. And then
the sperm.
And like obviously they have to retrieve the sperm and then they like mix them together.
Right.
Like and a little test tube situation.
There's a couple different ways. There's that old school way where you basically just put them all in a petri dish and like see what happens.
Yeah.
And then there's actually like some people actually sort of forcibly like shove the sperm into the egg, which is we are not scientists, as you can tell.
Yeah.
So there's a couple different methods, but essentially, yes, they take the sperm and the egg and put them together outside the human body in a petri dish, in a test tube, whatever, and then create embryos.
Yes.
Well, the embryos essentially make themselves. At the end of the day.
Because nature is cool.
Nature is cool, God is cool.
And then they take those embryos and they manually implant them into...
Okay, so that's actually a huge misconception.
What?
A lot of people use the word implants, which is actually very inaccurate. They actually transfer them. They just sort of stick them in and hope for the best.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. You're kind of like they have to implant themselves.
Yeah.
You're just sticking them in there and being like, go for it.
Yeah, good luck.
Good luck. And then sometimes they implant and sometimes they don't.
Yes, and a lot of times they don't.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of, sometimes they do pre-implantation genetic testing, which is very problematic, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
To try to give the mother the best possible chance of having a successful pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, and there's all sorts of different things. I mean, like the stuff that women will go through to try to ensure that a baby implants is honestly insane. Like there's like hormones that you take and there's meds that you take, and then some women are like, oh, I read that like you laugh a lot today.
People are like propping their legs up on the walls.
Yes,
no, I was like, I've got friends that have, yeah.
And so, yes, it's a whole process. So the problem actually begins before they even put the egg and the sperm together. So getting sperm out of a man is pretty straightforward, and I'm not going to explain it because Mikayla doesn't need to hear it, but I'm sure you can imagine it. Getting eggs out of a woman is actually much harder. And so what they often, although not always, but often do is they stimulate the ovaries to produce a ton of eggs, and then they go in and get them and try to get like a bunch of eggs, like sometimes 10, 15, 20 or more eggs. So in a typical cycle, a woman will drop 1 egg, maybe 2. There are some women who will drop like more than that. And then you'll see like families with like high incidence of multiples, like twins or quads even. But most women, it's 1 egg a month, like 1 egg. And then sometimes 2, but very often 1. And then if you have twins, then that means you either drop 2 eggs and both were fertilized, or one was fertilized and then split, resulting in identical twins. Right. But the natural course of things is typically 1 or 2 eggs.
Right. So they're stimulating ovaries to release more than
release. Yeah, obviously.
Right, because I was like, because women have like a finite number of eggs.
Right, and you have them all when you're born.
Yeah,
which is wild. But so women sometimes they have a lot of issues from that. There's actually like
I can imagine that
can be
not
very
super
painful.
Great.
Yeah, and then they have to go in and retrieve all of these eggs. And so again, like I kind of briefly alluded to, earlier, IVF is very much a numbers game, so it's very expensive. It's expensive to stimulate your ovaries and get a bunch of eggs out. It's expensive to go through making embryos, and it's expensive to do transfers. And so the clinics will often encourage people to make as many embryos as possible. So let's say that you go in and you do the whole like hyperstimulation thing, and you produce 10 birds, release 10 eggs, and then they go and they try to fertilize all of those eggs.
Yeah, because you want options.
Right. So first of all, now we have a problem because now we've gone into the woman's body and we've essentially stimulated it to do something it's not really designed to. Because you're not designed to produce 10 or 15 or 20 or more eggs at a time, or release all of those eggs at a time. So that's problematic. The next thing that's problematic is now we have potentially tons of embryos being created, and there's really the intended parents are often not planning. I mean, who plans to have 10 children through IVF? Like, I'm not saying that having 10 children is awful. I mean, I'm frankly more than halfway there, but most people are not planning on doing like that many transfers.
Yeah.
So let's just say
it's expensive to do that many transfers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's say our mom in the scenario has 10 eggs. They put them together with the sperm, and now we have, I don't know, 6 or 7, what they would say are viable embryos. So now we have another problem. What about those that aren't considered viable embryos? Are they embryos?
Yeah, like what does viability mean at this point? Because is it a matter of like, well, something didn't mix right? Or is it a matter of this one might have a chromosome issue?
Well, we haven't even gotten to that yet.
Yeah, it was like, so the question of viability here is like instantly a red flag.
Right. So the doctor or the tech or the clinician or whoever it is looking at these embryos and saying, okay, these 7 seem pretty healthy, but these 3, okay, maybe they aren't growing anymore. Maybe the eggs never fertilized. Maybe they just don't look right. And so now we have sort of the first act of discarding, where a clinician, a tech, a doctor is looking at embryos and saying they're not going to make it.
Yeah.
And maybe they're right.
Yeah.
But like, we're essentially now passing a value judgment on a person, a very small, microscopic person, but a person, and saying, you're not going to make it. You're not worth it.
Yeah.
You didn't make the grade. You didn't make the cut. You don't look right. The edges aren't right. You're not round enough. I mean, whatever, like, because they're very round. Actually, I'll send you a picture. I'll send you a picture of embryos and you can throw it up.
Okay.
Because it is pretty cool. They're round. And if they're not very round, then it kind of makes you think like, oh, they're probably not.
Right. Yeah, there must be something wrong.
Yeah, and there could be.
Yeah.
Because again, this could happen this could happen a lot when a woman is trying to become pregnant or is having sex naturally, where an egg is fertilized and it doesn't implant or it doesn't survive, and we just aren't.
Yeah, or it does implant and there's some sort of chromosome issue that ends up ending the life early. You know, like stuff happens all the time. Yeah. So
now we have 7 embryos. So let's say our couple, they are like, okay, well, we don't want to have 7 kids, or maybe we do, but we really want to make sure that we have a really good run the first time. So let's get them tested. Not every couple gets their embryos tested.
No.
But now the IVF clinic is going to take cells from where the placenta forms, and they're going to scrape just a couple few, I'm talking like 3 to 5 cells off, and they're going to test them to see if those cells show chromosomal abnormalities. They're also going to tell you the sex of the baby, which can be problematic, right? Because now the parents are like, okay, we had 7 embryos, 4 of them are chromosomally normal, 3 of them are abnormal, and then of the normal ones, 3 are girls and 1's a boy. So now mom and dad are starting to make decisions.
Yeah. Do I want a girl? Do I want a boy?
Right. Do we keep the abnormal embryos? Or do we discard them? If we don't want them, do we donate them to science? Do we just frankly throw them away? Do we freeze them indefinitely? Do we try to find an adoptive home for them? And most parents, while finding an adoptive home is great, they often won't make that decision until they're done having their own children.
Right.
So let's say they decide to freeze all of them. So they freeze 7. So now they have to decide, okay, looking at our normals, we have 3 girls and 1 boy. Do we want a boy first? Do we want a girl first? We have 3 girls. Should we try transferring a girl first in case it doesn't work because we have 2 other girls sort of on deck and we only have 1 boy?
Let's line up the roster.
Honestly. And so it becomes this sort of values conversation.
Yeah.
Really a values conversation that as humans we are not intended to have.
Right.
Do I want my oldest to be a boy? Do I want my oldest to be a girl? Do we even want 3 girls? Maybe we just want 1 girl and 1 boy.
And I think in the States, we often, because we hear about cultures who have different values depending on gender, right? Like we know it's a thing. Other cultures treat women differently. They treat men differently. I grew up in a culture that valued men over women. So like it was because they limited how many children you could have. So you're only allowed to have 1 child, at least at the time. And so you want that child to be a boy because that's gonna, carry on the family name, blah, blah, blah. And I think here in the States, sometimes we look down on cultures who are like that and we'd be like, oh my, like having an abortion just because she's a girl would be just, oh, right? Or like, no, like girls have, I mean, we're very much so a raw women's rights type of culture. Yeah. And yet here we are being like, well, like given the choice, not very women's rights of us, I'm just saying.
Yes. So there are individuals in the States who are from cultures that value boys more than girls, and they would 100% be like, well, no, we're going to do IVF and we're going to sex select for boys. Yeah. There are also individuals in the States and other very modern cultures that will only go for girls. Because they see boys as more problematic. They're noisy, they're loud, they're dirty, they are harder to raise.
They have cooties. They have so many cooties.
So, I mean, they can't help it. They just can't help it.
I feel like they might help it a little bit. Like, I feel like they could probably, like, wash their hands or something, like...
Sorry to all the men out there.
Wash your hands.
Yes, wash your hands, but also you don't really have cooties or fine. So let's say our couple decides, let's transfer 2, which is a pretty common choice, because not all of them will implant. So let's take one of the girls and we'll take the boy and we'll transfer them. Okay. So now, mom waits 10 days, takes a pregnancy test, it's positive, good news, goes in. Now she's pregnant with 1 boy or 1 girl, or 2 girls and 1 boy if the girl splits, or 2 boys and 1 girl if the boy splits, or 2 girls and 2 boys.
Right.
Or some other combination.
Because sometimes embryos just do stuff like that.
Right. Embryos like, are like, what if there was 2 of us? How fun would that be? Okay, do you remember Mikayla and Sarah? I mean, she's not Sarah.
Yeah.
She was so funny because I was asking her if she was close to her sister, and she literally answered, yeah, we used to see the same person. Because they're identical.
Yeah.
It was like the cutest thing. She was like, yeah, we used to be the same person. And I was like, Mikayla, that was a long time ago. I feel like you could have drifted.
At that point, we started getting into environmental factors, like nature versus nurture, like this.
Anyway, yeah. So, and then even with just a twin pregnancy, often women are encouraged to selectively reduce.
Right, because, I mean, they introduce problems.
Right. It can be harder to carry twins than to carry a singleton. You could...
It sounds so proper, a singleton. I know that that's the proper term, but, like, it sounds so proper.
I try.
Like, let me just, like, get out my little cup of tea. Singleton.
So, and that's not necessarily something that's limited to IVF, because of course you could become pregnant with multiples naturally, or you could be using like Clomid or another fertility drug that causes you to ovulate and release more eggs, and you can end up with multiples. But it's definitely something that happens with IVF, where you transfer more than 1 embryo and you end up with multiples, and now your doctor's essentially saying like, oh, we could selectively reduce.
It's a cost thing. Like having multiple transfers is going to cost more money, so transfer multiples at once.
Right. And, okay, so our couple, let's say they don't do that. They're not doing that. So they have their twins. They have a boy and a girl. They give birth. Now, okay, you have 2 children. You've already been through IVF once. Now you still have 2 girl embryos left. And then you have these 3 abnormal embryos. So let's say our couple decides to do 1 more transfer. They do the 2 girls and they have 1 girl. So now they have 3 children, which is often considered to kind of be like the ideal number of children in the United States. Yeah. I would say that we're very much in a culture where 2 or 3 children is considered ideal.
Yeah, because I think like the national average is 2.5.
Yeah. And having half a child is a challenge.
Yeah.
You really got to commit. You got to go the whole way.
Like, I feel like something went, like, that's girl math.
Yes.
Like we girl math that one. So we're just going to round it up to 3.
Right. So now they have 1 boy and 2 girls, and now they have this problem. They have 3 embryos. So not only 3 embryos left over, they have 3 abnormal embryos.
Right.
And not many people, although there are some, which we will discuss in a moment, will adopt an embryo that has tested abnormal. Because their chances of implanting and growing to term with no problems are lower. And like I said, IVF is a numbers. If someone is getting into IVF, it's because they struggled with fertility most of the time. There are other things. There's same-sex couples, and there's single mothers by choice, which are also problematic in different ways. But we're talking about like a married couple. We'll talk about that in some other. Yeah, we're talking about a married couple using IVF.
Yeah,
and using their own gametes, their own eggs, their own sperm in this scenario. And it's still problematic, okay? Because now we have these 3 embryos. So what do? We discard them. These people. They can keep them frozen indefinitely, which is not free.
Yeah.
You have to pay every year for storage.
From embryo, because that's what they are. That's a gestational age.
Yes. It is not a judgment call.
Yes. And so even though we're using the term embryo, please know, like, these are people that we're talking about. We're just talking about gestational ages.
Like, I might refer to Mikayla as an adult. I mean, I probably would, but
that's fine. I don't know that I would refer to me as an adult.
Or I might refer to our board president, Tom, as a senior. Right?
Yeah.
Or I might refer to my 9-year-old as a child. Like, those are developmental descriptors.
Yes.
And an embryo is a developmental stage.
Yes. But they're all people.
All people.
Tom is a person. I'm a person.
You're a person. Jonah's a person.
Jonah's a person.
And so are embryos.
Yes.
They just don't have names.
Yes. So we've got this couple. They've had their 3 kids. But now we have these abnormal embryos that not everyone is going to adopt.
Right.
And so do we freeze them indefinitely, which costs money? Do we, like, that's kind of where we picked up.
Right. And then what is the spiritual, and I worry about this. So, and we will talk more about this in another episode. I am the mother of 2 children who were adopted as embryos. I always call them like adopted embryos, like they're still
but like
embryos.
I was like, but they have actually grown up.
They're like very large now. In fact, that was the phone call.
Because one of the adopted embryos called on the phone and was like, "Yeah,
hey mama, what's up?"
And he is large.
He is large.
He's large.
He is a chonky boy. Chonky.
I love him so much.
But the reality is there are very few individuals willing to adopt abnormal embryos for a lot of reasons. And Jeremiah is sort of the poster child. Because he's had a lot of health problems. And is that tied into him being an abnormal embryo? I don't know. I mean, maybe.
Yeah.
Probably not, because we tested his and all of his chromosomes are fine.
Yeah. Yeah, he doesn't have a chromosomal abnormality.
So, he does have a lot of health problems. And so,
he's just normal problematic.
He's just problematic. I love him. He's so great. But like, there's not a lot of parents who are willing to adopt abnormal embryos for that reason.
Right. And then we also get into, because, I mean, you brought it up, you adopted 2 embryos, and we'll have like a special episode where we'll just talk about
Jeremiah.
And
like Jonathan is Jonathan.
But it's important to note that you adopted 2, and they both were, quote, abnormal embryos.
Yes. Yep.
And Jonathan, while he was born premature with Jeremiah.
Thanks, Jeremiah.
I mean, he did his brief stint in the NICU, but it was
like it was a sentence.
A little bit. Like, he served his time, and then he left, and he has not been back. And from anyone who didn't know the story, Jonathan is a perfectly, quote, normal baby.
He is
like,
typical,
there's nothing, typical. I was like, there's nothing about him that makes you think this embryo started off abnormal. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and honestly,
but they both basically had the same chance, and one of them is Jeremiah.
Jeremiah.
And the other one, like, so all of that to say, being labeled as, quote, abnormal as an embryo, science is really cool.
Science is cool, but it is not absolute. And
it's not absolute, yeah.
The children's hospital that they both were at, well, Jeremiah's at now, but Jonathan, it's a long story. Anyway, the children's hospital that was involved with their care actually used them as a case study to be like, hey, maybe pre-implantation genetic testing is not all as proper. because both of them, when we tested them, so it was really interesting because the plan was when they were born, we would save their cord blood and test their cord blood. I didn't want to do a blood draw on an infant, right? That seems neat. But I wanted to know if there were any chromosomal abnormalities so that we could be watching for like developmental delays and like heart issues, and like just kind of do some screening and things to see if they needed extra care, because we declined any prenatal tests because I just didn't want to deal with it.
Well, because we know that prenatal testing also
isn't... it's also not 100%, but I didn't want to deal with like all the pressure to abort, which given how things worked out, I got it anyway, but I just didn't want to. And so the hospital lost their cord blood.
Yes, I do remember this.
They totally did, which is fine. I wasn't mad about it at all. The hospital was super upset, but I was like, whatever.
It happens. Sometimes we just lose stuff.
And I was like, I'm like looking, like she was like, we lost it. And I like literally looked under the crib. I was like, I don't see it either. And she's looking at me like, it's not in this room.
We're like, have you guys seen it before?
look behind the book. And so we had to wait.
Honey, lift the couch up.
That's where the keys are. So we had to wait months to find out if, and Jeremiah had some markers that we were like, we don't know.
Yeah.
And it turns out he does have a very unusual genetic syndrome, but it's not a full chromosomal abnormality, and it would not be picked up on any pre-implantation.
Right.
You know,
it was just a surprise.
It was just a surprise. So, like, they did all this testing to try to help their biological mother make good choices about, like, transferring the highest quality embryo, please.
Good choices.
Infer all the air quotes here. I love his bio mom, by the way. She's fantastic. We're friends now. But it wasn't accurate at all. And that's not to say that it's always inaccurate, because three of their biological siblings all tested abnormal. One of them was born with a chromosomal abnormality, and the other two were not.
Yeah.
And so it's not 100%. And based on that very small sample, it's not even 20, it's 20%.
Yeah, I was supposed to say, because the NIPT is, I mean, we did speaking of the banquet, that was something we talked about a lot at the banquet last year, was all of this prenatal testing, and we did a lot of research, and it turns out that it's up to 85% inaccurate.
Right, depending on what you're looking
for. Like false positives, basically, they would have like up to 85%.
Yeah.
That is a very
high percentage.
That's a very high percentage.
And
that's for like babies that are growing larger
yeah.
in the womb, let alone 3 cells off of an embryo in a petri dish.
Yeah. So we'll talk more about IVF more. We'll talk about IVF more later. But basically the bottom line is we want you to think about, and maybe you've already done IVF, maybe you're considering IVF, maybe you know somebody who's considering it. There are a lot of ethical problems with IVF.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who have, we only fertilize 2 eggs, and we're definitely using every egg that we fertilize. And I think that on the spectrum, it is possible to make IVF more ethical or less ethical. I'm not convinced that you could make it perfectly ethical, but it's also not my decision. Yeah. So my recommendation to people is, if you're going to go forward with IVF, do your research. Try not to let your heart lead you. I know, not from personal experience, but I know that when you want to have a baby, that can like override every other thing, right? That can make you so hurt and so just yearning for that motherhood and pregnancy and wanting a child that like looks like you and looks like your husband and is part of you and part of this love that you have with your spouse. And so sometimes I know because I've talked to women and men don't really look into IVF too much because they don't want to know.
Right.
And so don't fall into that trap. If you've already done IVF and you have embryos who are frozen, just realize like those are people, those are your children, just as much your children as the ones that are running around or that you're pregnant with. And then choices need to be made concerning those children that honor their lives. Mm-hmm. Just as you would honor the life of a child who's already born. And so, that's the episode. I know it got a little crazy there at the end with like IVF and adoption and embryo adoption abnormal, and we will talk more about those things in an upcoming episode. I specifically want to address using like donor gametes, so donor eggs, donor sperm. Also want to address things like surrogacy. But just know, if you're considering IVF, if you know someone who's considering IVF, do the research, encourage those people to do the research. And if you have children who are frozen, because that's what they are, right? They're children. Make sure that you're honoring their life and thinking of them as people just like you would think of your own child, your own born child as a person.
Yeah. So how can we make this a Jesus moment?
So not to like be too heavy, but the Bible tells us pretty clearly that if we offend a little one, that it would be better that a millstone was hung around our neck and we were thrown into.
That's pretty heavy.
That's
on a couple
heavy.
of different
On
levels.
a couple of different levels. And you can't get any littler than an embryo.
Yeah.
So we need to walk into these discussions honoring them, honoring their life, honoring their potential, with compassion for the parents who walked into these decisions, or maybe individuals who donated sperm, donated eggs, and may have children out there that they don't know about. But we also need to kind of address it head on and say, hey, what's our responsibility? Our responsibility is potentially parents if we've chosen to go the route of IVF, but also our responsibility as just the adult in the room.
Yeah.
Right? So to a certain extent, all of us as modern adults, because we have collectively, and I realize as Americans we don't think about ourselves collectively, but we are a collective. We've collectively created the science that allows this to happen. We've collectively created the government that allows this to happen. This is happening in our culture and in our community, and so we have a responsibility, even if we don't personally choose to go and do IVF. Yeah, I mean, that's my belief.
Well, and we make these decisions with, quote, like the collective good in mind. Even though we would say we're not a collective culture, the reality is we think about things like gene pools, which is something that comes up when we talk about IVF, is the gene pool. And that's very much so a collective aspect of society that we're thinking about when making these decisions.
Yeah. So we'll talk more about it later. Pretty, a little bit of a crazy topic. We'd love to hear what you think. Please don't send us email if you've chosen to do IVF.
Yeah, and we reiterate that children who are born from IVF are people, and we love them, and we love parents who have done IVF. Mm-hmm. Like, this is not a judgment that we are casting on people. It is a conversation that has to be had, and things that we have to learn, because we don't have the privilege of just not knowing.
Right. We can't pretend we don't know. We can't close our eyes and not look. And we have to understand that there's over a million frozen embryos in the United States alone. That's not counting overseas. And each one of those is someone made in God's image. Mm-hmm. And so what is our responsibility as Christians for those embryos? Mm-hmm. And and we'll talk more about that. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching, listening, and we'll see you next time.